All right, chapter 7. Let's do it. I try to start every PowerPoint off with a song. That's my thing. But if it doesn't work, whenever if I forget, remind me. Okay, ready, go. Ready, so worth it. There we go. No, I don't want to start there. Who sang it? Who was it? The Beatles. I had to make sure I stopped it, or else there'd be like copyright issues and blah blah blah. All right, so let's do this. You say you want a revolution. So let's talk about just kind of big ideas that were at the foundation of America that ultimately is going to lead to this revolution. The first one is just this idea of republicanism. I know you've obviously heard that word a lot, but really, what is the root there? What does it really mean? And really, what it means is that that citizens are going to kind of work and give up some things for the common good. So it's just a big emphasis on citizenship and what that their role is. And like that is different from England, right? England didn't really care about its citizens. It's more coming from the top down. So that's republicanism. Yeah, give up interest for the common good. Um, and we see that as like obvious right now, but again, it's not obvious back then. It was not the norm at all. And then the other big idea, which again is such a norm for us, is just this idea of liberty. What does liberty mean? It's freedom from autocracy and giving people the reasoning to think things through themselves. And there's a political group in England called the Radical Whigs. I don't know if you know this, but later on, America has its own Whig party, and it really kind of stems from these guys. But what the Whigs are say in England, they are against the king. They are against monarchy because they are taking their rights away. And so here, that idea has kind of come over to America as well, and just that idea of be aware of when your rights are threatened. Be aware of the threat of a monarchy. Um, so anyway, these are kind of these basic ideas that were in America from before. And then we know because of their time across the ocean, across like getting salutary neglect, we've talked about that a couple times, they became autonomous, which means doing things for themselves. And they had a large degree of democracy, which again wasn't the thing in England. So again, if all these things are a part of America's, weaving, I think I was trying to say something deep there. The the woven fabric of American society. Yeah, that's okay. So we're coming off of the French and Indian War, right? But this another kind of economic idea that was around is mercantilism. And mercantilism kind of has two ideas here. It's the belief that countries who have the most money have the most power. And I think, again, today we kind of see that as a natural idea. But this capitalism evolved, right? Industrial revolution, those kind of things evolve. Wasn't always there. But like I said, okay, so it's wealth. Take that picture away. Um, Whatever country has more wealth has more power. Okay, well, then there's this next step of mercantilism. How do you get wealth? And the biggest idea is that you have to export more than you import, right? Yeah, that makes sense. You're exporting goods, you're selling goods away from your country, selling them out more than you're importing and buying goods from other countries, right? If you get an allowance of $10 a week, you want to you don't want to spend it all, right? You don't want to trying to liken that to importing. You don't want to buy all these things. You may go make a profit off your $10. I don't know if that's realistic, but whatever. Um, so England, it thought about this and said, okay, well, how do we export more than we import? Well, let's use the colonies, right? Let's use them as our main source. Let's export everything we can there. Let's have them buy our markets, be our main markets. And if they want to sell outwards, they being the colonies, want to sell outwards, they need to go through us. So we already know about the navigation law back in 1650. Remember we talked about that? What was that? Right, well, that's where they had to go through England first in order to sell somewhere else so that England could kind of put a higher tax on it. Eventually, there's also going to be other things like they have to only go on British vessels or British ships and eventually only sell to Britain in general. So there's different levels and they're not really enforced. What's that word again? Salutary neglect. Okay. Um, and just kind of this is just a little bit more background of before we get to this revolution. Britain had put down this idea of we can veto anything we want to. We're not going to very often, but just so you know, the king has a royal veto, and they can boom say whenever they want to. No, we don't like that law. So it's just kind of this idea of whenever we want to, we can exercise our control. All right. So here we go. French and Indian War. Britain is in a lot of debt, right, from defending the colonies. And remember, it was a 7 years war as well. So how do we make our money? Well, Prime Minister Grenville decided we need to tax them. We tax our own people. Now we need to go tax the colonies. And the first one is the Sugar Act of 1764. And I know you've heard, well, maybe you've heard this. So the Sugar Act is the first, here, this is why it's important. It's the first tax for revenue for the crown. Revenue means making money, right? So the first tax on the colonies for revenue for the crown. And that's a big deal. And a lot of these colonists did not like it. And it's basically a tax on any sugar that's going to be imported from the West Indies. And we all know sugar tastes good, right? That's something that the colonies like. And so eventually they're going to protest it and protest it. And the prices are going to come down. The tax is going to come down. So that's interesting, right? That's a first step of them. We already talked about like Molasses Act and how they smuggled around that, right? But this is a tax, right? It's a little bit different. Okay, the Quartering Act. Look at that picture there. We know what this one is. This gave British soldiers the right to have quarters in America. And basically, the colonists had to find places for them to live. So kind of put that burden of soldiers onto the colonists, and they didn't like the soldiers. We talked about that already. And these are also not going to be like the best soldiers from Britain. So this is a very like not just inconvenient, but a little bit more like private even. Like, gosh, putting that on to their private lives to figure out housing there. Well, here's the big one, stamp tax. And stamp tax, as you can see, was this stamp that had to be on really a lot of paper documents. Anything legal that anybody needed, weddings, funerals, legal documents. I mean, even on newspapers, cards, playing cards. It ended up being on a lot of stuff. And nowadays we have taxes like sales tax, right? If we buy something, there's taxes onto that, and it's something that we're not really. I mean, obviously, if it went up high, we recognize that, but we're used to it, is what I'm trying to say. Um, but the colonists hated this. It's on almost everything. It's a tax that they directly had to deal with. versus like indirectly at a port, where they're not really buying it. It's just the merchants that are having to pay the tax. Um, so they are going to, this is also just something kind of random that comes from this. Admiralty courts were basically when people broke the law, usually British subjects, they could be sent home either to Britain and be tried there, right, in a place that would be better for them, um, or they could, be tried here without juries. So, all right. Well, the big phrase, I'm sure you might have heard of this before, no taxation without representation. How fancy does that sound? I love the little rhyming scheme there. What does that mean? What it meant is like, okay, we might give you this idea that there can be taxes because there had been taxes. We talked about, taxes for the church. Um, but here's the key difference. We're not taxing ourselves here. You are taxing us from across the ocean, and we are not represented in that legislator that's deciding this, right? We are not in Parliament. Parliament decides this. There's nobody there that represents us. So that's their slogan. And it's interesting, like what would have happened if they actually were represented? Do you think it still would have gotten passed? Probably. But anyway, that's their phrase. Well, the king kind of comes back with this idea. Well, you are represented virtually. What that means is you're essentially there because we all represent you, right? Although you're not physically there, we're looking out for you. Well, obviously that doesn't fly. And so the colonists decide, like, how are we going to respond to this? So, they have a Congress. It's interesting because this is a big idea I want you to remember. Really, all the way up, even from after the first shots were fired, after Lexington and Concord, even after that, the colonists, a majority of them still want to come back to Britain. Like they still want to be loyal to the crown. They're just annoyed at the economic aspect of it. So, like here, when they're going to have this Congress, they're trying to figure out ways that they can come back or still be in relationship with Britain, but let's just fix the economic side of it. So here, they're in this Congress. What they do is it's 9 of the colonies come. So that's a step up. Remember last time, the Albany Congress, there were 7 colonies. Now you have 9. Just so you know, it's going to work its way up from 7 to 9. The next one's going to be 12, and the last one will be 13. Colonies will be there. So 9 colonies. That's very good. They are going to draft a list of, one of my classes made fun of this a couple years ago, a list of grievances. Your book says that a couple times. What is a list of grievances? It's like a list of complaints or frustrations that they have. Like, this is why I grieve. And they send that list back to the king and say, will you go back on some of these acts? But they kind of get laughed at here. So something else that comes out of here are the non-importation agreements. All right, what do you think that means? It's pretty straightforward. Here they decide that they are not going to import things from Britain. So a lot of these colonists kind of take this idea and it spreads into all the colonies. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of loyalists. We'll use that word for now, but we'll talk about it later. People that are loyal to Britain who don't agree with everything. But this idea is starting to spread. Let's agree to not import anything from Britain. We'll kind of make our own clothes, make our own fill in the blank. Why do that? Because it's not a military like fighting mechanism. It is an economic way of going about this. If we can hit Britain in their pockets, maybe they'll realize, what they've done and go back on some of these acts. Now this picture right here, this is called tar and feathering. Tar and feathering. And what ended up happening is there are these groups that developed the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. There were the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty, so two different groups. And they were basically the really passionate ones during this whole kind of cause. And they're going to be organizing protests and that kind of thing. Well, this picture right here, tar and feathering, what they would do is they would strip somebody naked. Let me tell you who first. Anybody who they found out were importing things from Britain or weren't really following some of these protests or non-importation agreements. So strip them naked, cover them in hot tar. Hot tar. Tar is like what you make driveways out of, right, and roads. So pour the tar on them and then cover them in feathers, right? Can you imagine trying to deal with that? So yeah, this is right here is in like a paper. The true-born Sons of Liberty are deferred to meet under Liberty Tree at 12 o'clock this day to hear the public resignation that's an S early, desired. The public resignation under oath of Andrew Oliver, distributor of stamps for the province of Massachusetts Bay. This group got feisty. It's going to be organized by some really hostile people, especially as the time goes on. But, I mean, it was a big form of bullying of people who did not agree with them. So, because of that, they would tar and feather people who either smuggled stuff in or people that were stamps. He was a distributor of stamps, so he worked for Britain. And so eventually, because of the economic reasons and the bullying here, it got repealed. Boom! So the Stamp Act Congress was successful in getting it repealed. It's a big deal, right? Huge deal. That's something they did. They stood up to the big guys and it got it repealed. Well, England wanted to make sure that they still knew their place, the colonists knew their place, so they passed very soon after the Declaratory Act, and really all it did was declare that England was still superior and that they were still sovereign, and that they essentially could enact whatever kind of laws that they felt like. So it's just like, okay, we're gonna listen to you, we'll repeal it, but just so you know, I'm like still your big brother here. All right, so I can do whatever I want to, kind of thing. Well, things begin to heat up a little bit. So after the Stamp Act gets repealed, they decide to pass something else, the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts are basically a group of taxes on things like lead and paint. But the big thing is going to be on tea. Now, if you know anything about Britain culture, even today, British culture, tea is a big deal. It's like our coffee here in America. If somebody took coffee away from me, I don't know about that. I would not be very happy, and I'd have like a headache and be more grumpy. Okay, so because of that, people are not happy about the Townshend Acts. There's going to be a lot of smuggling of these things that are being taxed. Well, Britain is going to bring over some redcoats. Okay, so some British soldiers are coming over, especially in the areas of high rebellion that are kind of some protests. So one particular is going to be Boston. Boston is going to be kind of at the core of a lot of the rebellion, Massachusetts Bay, right? Well, the Boston Massacre happens, and it's interesting the backstory here. So I just like looking at this picture for a second. I'll come back to the picture, but basically the story goes is that in Boston there had been a protest over someone who was basically supporting Britain. There'd been a protest, and then one of the British redcoats fired, and a boy was killed. I think he was 11 years old. Well, so a couple days later, they decide to have like, the colonists are starting to get frustrated. They don't like these redcoats in their town, and a crowd of about 60 people start to gather. And there's one poor soldier by himself, one British soldier, kind of guarding this British bankish. Um, and this is so great. They start out just throwing some snowballs, right? We're going to throw snowballs. But what ends up happening is, sticks get thrown, rocks get thrown, and eventually the guy gets nervous and he starts to call for some backup. So you get more redcoats show up, and the crowd is hostile. It's a little bit chaotic, and all of a sudden a gunshot goes off. They're not sure if it was accidental or happened on purpose, but then more gunshots go off. Go off. 5 people, 5 colonists end up getting killed, and 6 get wounded. Um, so they're going to call this the Boston Massacre. Now, when we think massacre today, that's not probably the amount of people we would think of, right? That is a propaganda tool, right? This whole thing here is going to be propaganda. Massacre, right? This big massacre happened. 5 deaths is a lot. Don't get me wrong there. But something else here. Look at this. So Patrick Henry takes this other painter who paints this, and Patrick Henry actually engraves it and then distributes it out, and it gets out in papers across all the colonies, and they say, look what happened here in Boston. Okay, so what's the message here? What's the point of view? Let's start with point of view. So the point of view here is it pro-Britain or anti-Britain? It's anti. If you look, there's only one group shooting here. There's some other interesting things I just think they like to point out here. I mean, it makes it look pretty gruesome, right? There's a little dog. Why put a dog in there? Just to show how inhumane, maybe. The first guy to die, this is just random fact, Crispus Attucks, or Attucks, I'm sorry. First guy that was killed. His name is always famous. It's like a good trivia question there. All right, so boom, the massacre happened. Now what? Now the colonists are very mad. One of the famous ringleaders is going to be Sam Adams, and just like to throw some names out: Sam Adams, Patrick Henry. What's that noise? My printer's going off. Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, that totally took me. John Adams. Okay, that's good for now because I can't think. So Sam Adams, what he's known for, other than being on a beer now, he is known for starting this thing called the Committees of Correspondence. And really what they were is they were writing letters to keep everybody in the colony straight on what was going on, what were protests, just organization in the colony. So nowadays, we have text, we have Twitter, we have, plenty of too much news. Back then, this is what they had to do: deliver letters, handwritten letters. Eventually, all the colonies are going to have this. And so it keeps them kind of organized together, right? So they're talking to each other, they're organizing, telling them what just happened in Boston. Well, then this happens. The British East India Company gets a monopoly on tea. Okay, great. What is that? Why is that bad? The price actually comes down on tea, but the point is there's a monopoly And the king is monopolizing, taking his power and giving it all to the British Trading Company. So this is a rebellion starts to happen in a lot of places. Charleston rebels, Annapolis burns like all the tea that comes in on these ships. There's another city I can't remember. Basically, it says, "Nope, see ya, get out of this harbor. We don't want any of your tea." It doesn't even let them come into the harbor. Well, Boston has a little bit of a different story. And P.S. You should, if you haven't visited Boston, it is a really cool city to visit. So much U.S. history. You can go kind of see this reenactment. I would picture myself somewhere doing at this. Okay, so what happens here? The governor is like all about the governor of of Massachusetts is all about, you know what? I'm gonna make them take this tea. They will take this tea. Um, but Boston is not happy about it. And so what they end up doing is they end up dressing up as Native Americans. I'm sure you know the story, right? Going onto these ships of the East India Company and throwing them overboard. And Boston becomes this port of tea. And so this company never gets like a dime for any of their tea that they need to sell. So, how did the British feel about it? Not great. They're going to pass another set of laws because now they're extra mad. The Intolerable Acts. There's another name for it, the Coercive Acts. You ever heard about that? And basically, it's a set of a couple different laws in there. But like one of them, the biggest thing is England is closing Boston's port. Boston cannot export, they cannot import. They are locking it up until the town of Boston agrees to pay the Dutch East India Company for what they threw over. Boston doesn't want to do that. Okay. Just kind of some other things that happened. They hold on, I lost it. Oh, they basically take away Massachusetts charters and change their elections, their town meetings. They really clamp down on Boston. Well, at the same time of this, and I know there's a lot of acts. Really, you know, if you break it down, there's probably only like 7 or 8. And we're going to do an activity on this too. But Quebec Act. So we know that Britain is in control of this Canada area. There's a lot of French people living in there. So the basically a couple things happen here. One is they allow these French people to keep Catholicism, and we already talked about this before, but Protestants and Catholics don't really get along at this point. They fear some of the Catholic Church's power. So that's one part of the Quebec Act. Another part is, if you can see in this map, Britain enlarges. Where's my thing? Enlarges Quebec by all this, right? Look at that Ohio River Valley. Well, how do the colonists feel about that? Not great. Not great. And then lastly, basically they continue to make sure that Quebec does not have any representative government. That it's still very autocratic, and they're not really giving them juries. So why does it matter? Obviously, the land matters. We already know the Catholic matters. The representative thing, the colonies basically see that as okay, look, see, they are being autocratic. They are taking away rights. And that's what they'll do to us too. So it's a kind of like, let's fight the power thing. So both of these things motivate the colonies. They're unified a little bit now with the committees of correspondence. So they organized the First Continental Congress, and there are, do you remember how many? 12 colonies at this now. This is almost unanimous. Guess who's missing? Womp womp, Georgia. Come on, Georgia. I mean, I guess it's a far road here, or far trip. It's in Philadelphia. So yes, that's a long drive up there on your horses. Okay, First Continental Congress. So, what are they doing here again? Basically, they're drafting a response to the Intolerable Acts. Still trying to go about this in a peaceful way. And again, I'm going to say this one more time. They still don't want to be independent from Britain. They really don't. They want to basically go back to where they were. Let's go back to salutary neglect. Um, and in the meantime, they're also going to come up with this idea called the association. The association takes the non-importation agreements and makes them even more extreme, I guess. Basically, there's no importation, there's no exporting to Britain. And now, and the third thing is there's no just even consumption of British goods. It's just totally boycotting British goods completely. Um, and again, going economic side at this, right? It worked once, let's try it again. Now, in the back of their mind, they do realize that, yes, we don't want some kind of military battle, but we understand that this might be a thing. And so they do start training their militia, who were already revved up for the French and Indian War. And then Lexington and Concord comes. And sorry, I'm going to mention real quick. You're going to have some really big wigs here, right? You're going to have George Washington, John Adams, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, all the really fiery ones that were at the beginning of all this movement. So, how did the actual first shots happen? So basically, the British soldiers are sent out near Boston, outside of Boston, to start gaining or getting the military weapons, any kind of, with lack of words here, military weapons that could be used against them, gunpowder, right? Well, they go and they happen to find some militiamen, and the first shots are fired in Lexington, and some militia colonists die. So then off they go to Concord, and this is actually where you've heard of the Minutemen. I don't know if you heard that. It's like the militia that came together in minutes to defend America, and I think it's like 300 British soldiers end up getting wounded. Maybe like 70 die. So that is legit kind of like a first big military encounter there. They call it the shots fired heard round the world. The shots heard round the world. But in modern culture, shots fired. Okay, I'm gonna show you something in a second, but just kind of real quick, where do women and African Americans and Native Americans stand during this? Um, Women there's going to be a lot of women that are going to take over the houses, right, and the fields of their spouses that have left and their sons that have left. There's going to be a lot of women that go to be camp followers, and so they go with the military camps and they cook and they sew. I think there's a rogue woman who goes and fights like Mulan and pretends to be a guy. But so yeah, women are more in the background of supporting the war there. African Americans. So there are going to be some African Americans who fight. There's also going to be some that do some like of the cooking and some of the camp business, like, anything from building camp to, cutting roads and that kind of thing. There's also going to be some African Americans that fight with the British because they were promised freedom afterwards. And then Native Americans, you're going to get them fighting on both sides. They're still kind of stuck in that, who's the good guys here? But it's not really good guys. They know there aren't many good guys for them, but it's who can support me in the moment. And so you do get people, tribes fighting for different sides. All right. I always think about this back in fighting back in the day. It is straight up. This is not guerrilla warfare where you're hiding. You are just going straight at these lines of battle are converging and shooting on each other. It's crazy. All right, who will win? I know you don't know the answer to this, but let's pretend we don't. Let's talk about strengths and weaknesses here. So strengths of England, they have more money, right? They have a bigger population, 3-1. That always helps. They have a stronger naval power. Now, why does that matter? So there's gonna be a lot of blockading. Blockading is on the coast and not letting other ships come in. So if there's other people that would come and help or just give them materials, resources, right? That blockade would help. They have a professional army, trained, versus our militia in America. They have some American loyalists, so they have people that live in America, these colonists that are still loyal to the crown, right? And so that's a difficult one for the colonists to work with. All right, now let's talk about some negatives. They have some bad decision makers in their government, very power hungry, inept government. They live far away, right? So even just getting messages sent and updates and military updates, it's going to be difficult. You're going to have infighting, right? Brothers. This is actually could be a negative for both, but people support both causes even within a family. All right, now let's talk about some pauses for America. They have strong leadership, especially George Washington. I told you, military prowess, maybe not so much, but like morale and people who believe in him, which is a huge part of leadership. Home field advantage, that's huge. That's pretty self-explanatory. Defense wins championships. I remember being told that by a coach. What it means here is all they have to do is hold the fort, right? They don't have to go and capture the flag, right? If they can come up with like almost a truce, or if they can hold their own, then maybe eventually England will give up. All right? America is spread out. There's no center city. I mean, you're gonna have New York and Philadelphia and are gonna be important, but in general, there's not like, oh, you take out one, you're done. Spread out territory. They have agriculture that can feed them, right? They're not importing it across the ocean. That should not be read. This is an advantage. That's why it says advantage. Moral advantage, meaning they had that like desire of this is what we want. We are fighting for our cause here, right? We are passionate about this. Versus England, a lot of people are just saying, oh, well, I guess this is what the crown wants. All right, here's an actual disadvantage. They're not as organized, both military and unity among the colonies. Inflation, their currency is not going to be great. So money is going to be a difficult thing. Manufactured goods. Who is their big manufacturer? England was, right? And so now they're going to have a shortage. And where will they get that from? Especially if there's a blockade. All right. It's a cliffhanger, guys. I don't know who's going to win. We'll see. Okay? You got it. You can do it. See you guys.